Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much for the kind opportunity. Osteoporosis section, our bone health section, and might absolute assessment with some screening of the osteoporosis. So the first is the output versus fracts and how we do it, and what about other risks as we're discussing it, and how much is it effective in predicting the osteoporosis. So there are two important things in the bone health and bone strength. One is bone quality. And if you look at the definition, this is the osteoporosis is characterized by low bone mass, microarchitectural destruction, and increased speed. So there are two things which basically define bone, and the second is the quality of the bone. So it leads to one thing detect with the help of the scans that we are doing our osteoporosis screening. Now, defined is the one which occurs with very low or minimal trauma, or a trauma that would otherwise not result in any kind of being. So if it is the first that is resulting from the standing height, if it causes any kind of a fracture. So if you look at the healthy bone, and if you look at osteoporotic bones, a lot of porotic areas are posed, and a lot of the microarchitecture destruction are thinning of the bone parenchyma is what differentiates a healthy bone from the osteoporotic bone, and this is the basis of the definition. So because most of the people who are having osteoporotic fracture, they come into the and they go to the orthopedic department, we need to understand that basically this process is driven by endocrine hormones. The peak bone mass that though maturity are the growth occur even up to the age of 18 years, where we usually define constitutional delay from the hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism. But we look the strength of the bone, or the bone strength is continued up to the age of 25 years. Started a bit earlier in the males and remained for a long time. And if you look at this graph, at the age of the 50 to 60 years, when there is menopause, this is a striking decrease in the density or quality of the bone because of the loss of the estrogen, which means that hormones are important for the bone health or for the quality of the bone. So clinical factor for the fracture, at the top, we are having advancing age above 65 or 70 is the one which alone characterize the risk for the osteoporosis, despite along or without other factors. And if there is a previous fracture, glucocorticoid therapy, well known, parental history of the hip fracture, low body weight is also one of the reason for the predisposing factor for the osteoporosis. And if there is a current smoking, rheumatoid arthritis, and secondary causes. If you look at the secondary causes, hypogonadism, premature menopause, malabsorption, and chronic liver disease, and that's why it's important that osteoporosis is basically an endocrine disorder. So first thing is FRAX. What is FRAX? FRAX fracture risk assessment tool. It was developed in 2008 by Sheffield University when it was a WHO collaboration center for the osteoporosis. It was developed over 8 years period. Or 8 years period since the launch of the FRAX model have been made available in the 64 countries. It has covered almost 80% of the world population. So means that it is having high acceptability. And this is the same thing that we discussed about the risk factors. Take into account the same risk factor and apply it in order to make the FRAX. So results are then given in the form of probability of the hip fracture and other major osteoporotic fractures. It is available web-based. It is along with the osteoporosis machine as well, and it is something in the paper as well. So I have put the data from the Pakistan. If you look at this, you can put the data of your country, and then age, date of birth. If you put this, even age will be calculated. Sex, weight, height, previous fracture. So these are some of the common things or common risk factors for the fracture that you use it, and then they calculate the risk for you. So these are the common risk factor for the osteoporosis that are put into this calculator, where age, sex, weight, height, previous fracture, very much important because this increases your risk of the fracture exponentially. Current smoking, glucocorticoids, and rheumatoid arthritis, and if there are secondary causes for the osteoporosis that include type 1 diabetes mellitus as well. long-standing hyperthyroidism, hypogonadism, premature menopause, to name the few that are related to endocrine. So because that was widely accepted, National Osteoporosis Foundation guideline recommend treatment on the basis of the FRAX, which means that it is being accepted or it is having a good acceptability. And that's why it is accepted as one of the indication for treating the patient. And these are the cutoffs. So major osteoporotic fracture risk is 20%. And if the hip fracture risk is 3%, then this is indication for the treatment based on FRAX alone. So what are the clinical benefits of FRAX? It provides a 10-year probability of the future fracture, though there are probabilities on the basis of the 2 years and 3 years or 5 years, but it is the 10 years the one which is having clinical significance. And based on the data from the multiple cohorts, so it is not a single cohort, there are multiple cohorts. They have taken the data and they have calculated the risk in order to avoid any kind of a cohort-specific study. So it is validated multiple times and recognized, and it is something which is easily accessible. So you need to put all of the data, age, sex, etc., and that's why you calculate it. And limitation are, this is number one of the indication for screening osteoporosis. This is not something to deal with the monitoring of the patient the way we do with the DEXA scan. So it is slightly different than that. And only femoral neck BMD is used in its calculation, and it is, of course, most of the factors that are for the osteoporosis, but it's not inclusive for all of them. And number two, the risk is yes or no. So it doesn't give any exponential response because various factors are not having same outcomes. So do patients with high FRAX benefit from treatment? We will be having another interesting talk on the treatment of the osteoporosis by Dr. Arshad Hussain. So we'll be discussing that. It has been validated in the untreated patient only, so it is not for the monitoring. This is only a diagnostic tool in those patients who are having osteopenia and they are not fitting into the criteria of the osteoporosis by DEXA scan. So it just accompanies that. Do we have other risk assessment scores as well? Yes, FRAX was one which become popular because that was widely accepted, because it was validated, and that's why it got applied in the many countries. But yes, we are having other risk assessment scores as well. One is KIO score, osteoporosis, OST, just self-assessment tool, ORI, and other scores as well. And if you compare these scores, this is one of the comparison study that is showing that if you compare with the other risk assessment tools, they are almost having the same predictability, even having limited number of the risk factor, and they are as effective as FRAX is. And if you look at the risk factor that they are calculating, look at the FRAX, almost 9, SCO and ORI, and OST, that's just including age and weight, based on only 2 factors, which means that weight is important, but at the top is the age that is important. Alone is a very high predictable factor for osteoporosis. Now, because the second session would otherwise become quite long because the treatment session is quite large, therefore we decided that after that I'll take the route of screening of osteoporosis rather than talking further about the FRAX. So in general, who should be assessed or who should be screened for osteoporosis? Women at the age of 65 years or older and men 70 years or older, regardless of the clinical features that they have, they should be screened for osteoporosis. Now, we just had a talk on growth hormone, we had a talk on the hypogonadism. These are some of the areas that usually we don't practice a lot. A person with the endocrine disorder, the diabetes, already having so many medication, and you don't have the heart to ask him to go for the osteoporotic screening or go for the scanning and go for the treatment, while probably we should be going because of the economic cost, the morbidity and mortality once you get a fracture then. So this is the age criteria. This is universal. That is by all the guidelines, NOF, AS guidelines, and that densitometry criteria. All of them are accepting this definition of 65 for the females and 70 for the males. And if even it is a postmenopausal woman or men, age 59, or younger postmenopausal woman, and women with a menopausal transition based on the risk factor profile. So yes, if we are touching this limit for the male or female, they should be screened. But if they are postmenopausal, our age is below this limit for male between 50 and 70, well, for 70, you go for the screening, but 50 to 70, then you need some other risk factor to put on so that you can say, okay, I'm sending this patient for the osteoporosis screening. In postmenopausal women and men 50 years or older who are already having a fracture, of course, you are going to send just because you want to note that this is my DEXA scan recording now, and after 2 years or 3 years that I'll be rescanning, I'll be making decision on the basis of that. Adults with a condition like rheumatoid arthritis, this is the one which is highly linked with the osteoporosis, and that's why I mentioned in all of the guidelines are taking medication, glucocorticoids, at the dose of 55 milligram or more prednisolone. We commonly know that though we are using 5 to 7.5 milligram, but it's usually 4 or something, some value near that, that is the natural replacement. Above that, this is usually overdosing that we are doing. Now, it is established that it's for the postmenopausal. Number one, old age spectrum. This is our common understanding. Now, the next thing is that if someone is having postmenopausal osteoporosis, then we have very limited data for that. And postmenopausal guidelines are generally not acceptable for the premenopausal one. In general, if there are no risk factor, there is no need of BMD, because we just decided that it will be 65 for the female and 70 for the male. But if there is a history of fragility fracture, or we are having known secondary causes of osteoporosis, like hypogonadism, untreated hyperthyroidism, premature menopause, etc., which are already predisposing you to the osteoporosis, then of course you'll go for the screening. Then who should be assessed in the premenopausal one? So history of fragility fracture, diseases, conditions, or medication that are associated with low BMD. All the three. Considering pharmacological therapy for osteoporosis, because then you need the DEXA scan at the beginning, and then when you need to monitor the therapy for the osteoporosis. Of course, these are some of the indication that it doesn't include the age limit criteria for that. So when we have all these scans, do we need something else? Yes, of course, for each and every condition, we need a good history in order to ask. This is the first picture, a second, smoking, etc., that we just discussed. We need a very good history. The second thing is regarding examination, because we note in journal BMI are the signs of the steroid excess or a hypogonadism sign, the one we discussed. Of course, we need to look at that as well. Some of the basic investigation which are needed are CBC, ESR, CRP, calcium phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase. This is the one where it either changes your decision to go for it, or it gives you the underlying disease, or it gives you, if you are a clue that if you are going to start with the medication, you should be having these things within normal limits. Based on that, if you find any clue of the underlying disease, then of course you need to go for the specific investigation for that thing. So these are other specific investigation, if hypogonadism, thyrotoxicosis, etc., etc. So the basic thing is to check the bone mineral density. As we just discussed, there is the bone strength and the bone quality. So the bone strength is on the basis of the BMD, where you calculate bone mineral density. This is gram per centimeter square. So it is the mineral component or mass of the mineral component in per centimeter square area. So, and on the basis of that, either you calculate a Z score or you calculate a T score. This is something in your kind notice. So BMD has been shown to correlate well with the bone strength, the one component of the bone quality. So instead of specific threshold, fracture risk increases exponentially as the BMD decreases. Though it is a site specific, I'm doing a hip BMD, that will be more specific for the hip osteoporosis. If I'm doing a lumbar spine, that is more for the lumbar spine. But generally, the one at the hip is the best predictor for the hip as well as for the other areas as well. And we check two sides because these are the one which are important one, or they correlate more with the risk of the further fracture. And spine for the premature menopause and response to the treatment, this is a good side then. And if there are osteophytes or you are having some nail plate, you can use the alternative areas for that as well. Now, this is for BMD. Now, how BMD is checked, this is on the basis of DEXA scan, and DEXA scan is the criterion standard for the evaluation of the BMD. Generally, we use central, that is lumbar and hip, and in some of the diseases, we can use forearm or heel or finger, for example, like hyperparathyroidism, if you go for the peripheral DEXA then. Now, T-score, because it's a mixed group of the people, we are TMOs, MOs, and all of them are sitting there. For some of the basic definitions are that the T-score is the one where BMD is compared with that of the young population who are at their peak of the bone mass density. And WHO has a normal T-score within one standard deviation, and the value is based on the basis of the standard deviation then. And the Z-score is the one which is mainly applied in the premenopausal woman, men younger than 50 years of age, or children, where you don't apply the T-score. So then you rely on the Z-score, where you match the same person with that match for that of the age and same sex, and then you calculate it. And that's why we don't define here osteoporosis. We define is that it is within the expected range if it is within the two standard deviation, and if it is below that, so below expected, below the expected range. So just the definition changes a bit if you go away from the t-score towards the z-score then. So these are the normal values based upon the BMD. The normal is t-score of -1 or above. Low bone mass is between 1 and 2.5. My t-score of for osteoporosis is 2.5. You all know that. But severe and established osteoporosis is when you have the same score and you are having one or more fractures as well. Then it's one of the definition of the severe osteoporosis. Now, how you will repeat BMD after the treatment initiation will be discussed by Dr. Arshad Hussain. But if you do a BMD and treatment is not yet started and it's 2.5 and above, of course, you are going to decide about the treatment. And if you are having a t-score between -2 and 2.49, which means just below the threshold for the diagnosis of osteoporosis, then BMD need to be repeated within 2 years. And if it is quite below that, quite towards the normalization side, like -1.5 to 1.99, then 3 to 5 years. And if it is -1 to 1.49, like quite healthy bones, that yes, you can repeat it within 10 to 15 years, different data, but it's good to do FRAX at 5 years and then decide on the basis of that to go for the BMD or further scoring or not. The second important thing is vertebral imaging. You know that the vertebral fracture are usually asymptomatic. So it's very difficult to know that the fracture has occurred, because if fracture occurs, this makes the definition for osteoporosis. And even with the absence of the BMD. So a vertebral fracture is consistent with the diagnosis of osteoporosis. Usually they are asymptomatic. And if it is found, it changes your definition of and changes your management plan as well. So this is if fracture occurs, it is a sign of impaired bone quality and strength, and it is a strong predictor of further vertebral or hip fracture. The hip ones usually diagnosed, but it's the vertebral fracture that we should take care of because it's asymptomatic in most of the cases. So a simple a simple classification for those who are having indication at the basis of the spine X-ray would be just above the one for the DEXA, like 65 in males, here for 70, and that was 70 and it's 80. If BMDT score at the spine or total hip is -1, less than -1, it means they are at high risk. Then yes, they can go check the vertebral imaging as well. These are the indication. And the women below that will be checked if they are having femoral neck BMD of less than 1.5. So the more high risk is, of course, you progressively changes the deadline for that. So the take-home message is you will all agree, or the international data is also consistent with that, that this is a condition which is usually underdiagnosed and this is undertreated, the way we discussed growth hormone deficiency and hypogonadism replacement therapy in the old age, and need to be more proactive to check for the t-scoring based on what the guideline says. If you do that, it will be quite good. Because if you think about the morbidity, then the spine fracture, the hip fracture, then surgery, and then rest at home, and then the bone pains, NSAIDs use, and further morbidity, it's quite linked with the further morbidity and mortality even within 1 year, 3 years, and up to 5 years. That correlates well, either directly or indirectly. So, and the next thing is economic burden. So these indications are usually based on the basis of the economic burden as well. That if a person goes for with the osteoporosis goes for have a fracture, then they'll be highly costly to do that. So it's mainly cost driven. So these are the references. These are some of the guidelines that usually cover osteoporosis. The NOF is quite popular. Then to meet the criteria is popular, but American Association guidelines are also regarding osteoporosis. I hope when you find time, you can read this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Tahir, for a wonderful talk. We will take the question from our audience at the end of the session. Moving on to our second talk, I would like to invite Dr. Sara Nadeem. She's a well-known endocrinologist currently working as an assistant professor at Aga Khan University Hospital, Karachi. She has a special interest in women health and bone health. She is going to talk about a very common and sometimes very confusing topic, vitamin D saga. Shall we treat everyone in 2021? Welcome, Dr. Sara.
Assalamu alaikum. Today I'll be talking about vitamin D supplementation, and the title of my talk is whether we should treat everyone in this year. Although we only have a few weeks left, I think we mean from now on. I have no conflict of interest to disclose regarding this talk. The overview of my talk, I want to show that to you, and then bit by bit, I'll come back to this overview explaining how as we proceed. So first, talking about what vitamin D deficiency is, how you define it, how do we replace it generally, and then talking about the benefits of vitamin D and the main gist of this talk, besides bone health, right? Because we all know about its benefits in bone health. Okay. So let's define what vitamin D deficiency is. In terms of bone health, there is very little controversy about how we define a low vitamin D level. There is a lot of debate and controversy about other modalities. But for bone health, we have a large, robust data over the years about a level of less than 20 being unfavorable for skeletal outcomes, which include fractures and bone loss. So a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level of more than 20 nanograms per milliliters is therefore the primary treatment goal when we are looking just solely at bone health and bone outcome information. Although there is a little bit of discussion whether we should try to go for a higher threshold, above 30 or above 40 even. But for 20 at least, there is unequivocal evidence from lots of studies through time that definitely a level less than 20 is detrimental to bone health. So I want you to remember this. Besides bone health, severe vitamin D deficiency has been defined as a 25-hydroxy vitamin D concentration less than 12. This has been shown to dramatically increase the risk of excess overall mortality, all-cause mortality, increased risk of infection, and many other diseases, and should be avoided whenever possible. So this is agreed to. The debate begins in between where what is insufficiency, mild deficiency. So the Endocrine Society guidelines actually define deficiency as a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level below 20 and insufficiency is a 25-hydroxy vitamin D circulating level between 21 to 29 nanograms per ml. Mayo Laboratories, where I trained at, defines a little bit in detail. So severe deficiency less than 10, mild to moderate deficiency between 10 to 24, optimal level, they give a wide range between 25 to 80. So this gives the clinician some leeway in deciding per patient what their optimal level should be. And a possible toxicity over 80 nanograms per ml is defined. The purpose in me showing you the Endocrine Society limits as well as Mayo Lab is to show that we know what severe deficiency is, besides bone health, in fact, but there is still debate and a lot of discussion about these in-between ranges, which are not severe vitamin D deficiency, but are still considered as insufficient. So let's talk about how the prevalence of vitamin D exists worldwide, right? We all know, all of us endocrinologists here and even general physicians, that there is quite a bit of vitamin D deficiency in the part of the world that we live in Pakistan, where over 20% of the population in different case series and studies have described vitamin D deficiency in over 20% of the population. In other parts of the world, also vitamin D deficiency is quite prevalent. Severe vitamin D deficiency is about 6% in USA, about 7.4% in Canada, 13% in Europe. A less than 20 level, 24% in USA, 37% in Canada. So severe is not as high in other parts of the world as in our part of the world, but mild vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency is quite prevalent worldwide. Why is that, right? You may ask, why is vitamin D deficiency such a prevalent issue? So there are multiple risks for vitamin D deficiency. This chart that I have up for you actually identifies the high risk groups. The high risk groups are those people in whom you are more likely to see vitamin D deficiency. So as you go down the list, I won't read every of the heading as you can, but you will see that we do have any chronic disease, particularly kidney, heart, liver failure, can predispose you to vitamin D deficiency. Gastrointestinal diseases, hospitalized individuals, especially ICU patients, may have malabsorption, as well as be away from the sunlight, where vitamin D exposure of the skin through sunlight is limited. Obesity, older adults, oncology patients, pregnant and lactating women, and people with respiratory diseases are all high-risk groups of vitamin D deficiency. So when you look at that, we see chronic diseases are increasing worldwide, also in our part of the world. So that is one of the possible reasons why we see such high vitamin D deficiency. The other reasons are not quite well explained, but these are some of the high-risk groups that we should consider. In our part of the world, obviously, people who cover themselves and have a very little skin exposure to the sun also have a higher risk of vitamin D deficiency. And then on the right are the medications. Multiple medications have been implicated in their role in causing vitamin D deficiency. That was one, the previous slide was telling you one situation about different risk factors that people may have. Another thing that you may discover is that sometimes certain findings on lab and X-ray may make you think about vitamin D deficiency, even if they don't have those risk factors. In lab evidence, if you see a low 24-hour urine calcium excretion, that is telling you that urine calcium tells us about how much calcium is actually being absorbed by the gut. And for gut absorption, vitamin D is essential. So if you see a low 24-hour urine calcium excretion, it could be one of two things, that they are vitamin D deficient or they're taking very low calcium. Again, elevated PTH level is a marker suggestive of vitamin D deficiency. Elevated bone alkaline phosphatase levels, that's a marker of bone turnover. Low serum calcium or serum phosphorus levels in lab can suggest that we should, if we have not already looked at vitamin D levels, we should check their 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels. Radiographically, if you see evidence of low bone mineral density on X-ray or on BMD, if they have non-traumatic fragility fractures or skeletal pseudofractures, then you could think of vitamin D deficiency risk. So we've gone through the vitamin D deficiency definition and what the prevalence is. Now I'll talk a little bit about vitamin D replacement. How do we do it when after we decide that they are deficient or insufficient? How will we replace? So there isn't a complete consensus internationally on the optimal level for vitamin D supplementations. The range from 400 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D are recommended generally worldwide, but that's a wide range. Why this range? Because when you give a daily dose of between 400 to 2,000, in most people, there is usually no need to monitor serum or urinary calcium levels or the renal function. So the risk of vitamin D toxicity is very low. The Endocrine Society's guidelines recommend 10,000 units as the upper daily limit. The Institute of Medicine and the European Food and Safety Authority also recommend staying below 4,000 international units per day. So generally, 400 to 2,000 is safe. In some people, you can go up to as high as 10,000 units per day, versus some the Europeans saying up to a limit of 4,000 per day. So how would you decide how much to give in a patient who has severe vitamin D deficiency, right? Defined as less than 10 nanograms per ml. So there are no direct clinical trials looking at different doses, different loading dose regimens. But generally, a commonly applied strategy, and that's what we do in Pakistan as well, is that we give a larger loading dose. In the United States, mostly 50,000 units is given. Here, we also have the 200,000 IUs of vitamin D available that is sometimes given. And then if you were going with 50,000 units once weekly for 2 to 3 months, or even 3 times weekly for 1 month, and then recheck. As they've noted in my slide, a review of multiple loading algorithms was done, and they saw that a minimum total dose, so the total cumulative dose of 600,000 units, which is 6 lakh, is best predicting an end of treatment goal, which is greater than 30. So if you start with a vitamin D level of less than 10, make sure that they get a cumulative dose of 600,000. I'm not a big fan of giving the full dose in one go. I try to stick with either just the 200,000 units once, followed by 50,000 units weekly for a period of 2 to 3 months, and then rechecking. And that will achieve a goal 25-hydroxy vitamin D level of 30 or above. For mild to moderate deficiency, obviously, we will adapt this accordingly, and that's more on the clinician per basis. So what I'll usually do is I'll give 50,000 units per week and maybe just give it for 6 to 8 weeks and then recheck vitamin D levels and to assure that we've achieved goal and then give them a maintenance dose. So that brings me to this next slide, that a lot of times many of us clinicians have made this error that we will replace and then we will all of a sudden stop and say no vitamin D. And then after a few months, you will see the vitamin D level go down again. So we don't want to make this mistake, right? Maintenance dose, once the 25-hydroxy vitamin D level reaches the optimal range, should be continued. Regardless of what the initial vitamin D therapy, if you give a large bolus continued, you should give at least 800 to 2000 units for a daily replacement. Otherwise, they will have recurrent deficiencies, and that's what the people will say that they keep fixing it and it keeps coming down because we missed giving the maintenance therapy. Some people in my practice need up to 5,000 units, even 10,000 units daily if they have other risk factors in terms of vitamin D deficiency. And some of those I mentioned down there is malabsorption. And tube feeding, sometimes you'll have to figure out the modality to give because some of the fat soluble depots may cause clogging of the food of the tube. So that's important to consider when you are giving vitamin D replacement in certain populations. Then I made a conscious decision only to say vitamin D when I was talking about replacement because there is, again, this question. I made a conscious effort to only say vitamin D and not vitamin D2 or vitamin D3 ergo or cholecalciferol when I talked about general replacement, because there is, people have this question, and I wanted to kind of address that separately, whether D2 or D3 is better, right? So studies have shown that a single dose of 50,000 units of vitamin D2 versus D3 produced a similar increase in the total 25-hydroxy vitamin D level, but there is a longer half-life of vitamin D3, which then lends to the fact that you can give less frequent dosing. So if you're giving a dosing which is less than once a week, then vitamin D3 is the preferred replacement for that patient. D2 may be preferred in a vegetarian or vegan diet, and both D2 and D3 is recommended to be taken with a meal containing fat to ensure maximum absorption. Now, as we talk about vitamin D replacement, I also want to touch upon vitamin D toxicity or over replacement. So vitamin D toxicity is not just a number. So just because the 25-hydroxy vitamin D level is 80 or 90, that is not automatically vitamin D toxicity. That places that patient at a high risk of vitamin D toxicity. But vitamin D toxicity is when you have a very high level of vitamin D coupled with hypercalcemia plus minus hyperphosphatemia or hypercalciuria. And usually it's the clinical signs and symptoms of hypercalcemia with which the patient will present, which could be nausea, dehydration, constipation, or hypercalciuria. This is rare, but sometimes is seen in patients who may be continuing very high dose replacement without following up with their physician on a regular basis. Now let's come to the benefits besides bone health, as I talked about. There is consensus. We all know we have clear physiologic data. We have research data that vitamin D replacement is essential for bone health. But it's this interest in the role of vitamin D beyond bone health that has garnered a lot of attention in the last decade or so, and I'd like to focus a little bit on that now. So, in critically ill patients, we have found vitamin D deficiency to be highly prevalent, and low vitamin D levels are associated with greater severity as well as mortality. So, supplementation of a high dose of cholecalciferol in the early stage of sepsis in one study has shown to rapidly increase the level of vitamin D, and it has shown to decrease levels of interleukins as well. Now, we don't have mortality data with that, but we would assume that if this is safe, we could use this as a trial, and we need bigger and better trials and more robust studies to define this and answer this. So, an ongoing trial is occurring in Europe. It's a multi-center randomized controlled trial in which severely vitamin D deficient ICU patients who have a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level less than 30 are randomized to a loading dose of either oral or enteral vitamin D3, followed by 4,000 international units daily for 90 days, and see what their 28-day mortality is. And I think this will answer a lot of this question about routinely replacing vitamin D in the ICU or not. Overall, all-cause mortality has also been shown to be associated with vitamin D deficiency. The key word here is associated. We don't have direct causation, but there is a strong association, especially also from a 2014 Cochrane meta-analysis, which showed relevant and significant lower all-cause mortality of 7% and decreased cancer mortality of about 13% in patients who received vitamin D replacement. So also we see that post-transplant patients who are vitamin D deficient have a prolonged hospitalization and may also have increased mortality. So it is commonly and routinely used in post-transplant patients in the post-surgical setting. Pregnancy, obviously, we understand physiologically that vitamin D is required during pregnancy because calcium requirements also increase, and we need to replenish that calcium back to the body. Vitamin D deficiency is also associated with worse outcomes during pregnancy, and at least 400 to 600 IUs of daily vitamin D, which is present in the multivitamins that pregnant women take routinely, is reasonable for women who have a vitamin D level which is less than 40. And you can obviously give higher doses if there is more severe of a deficiency. Diabetes, again, cause and effect relationship is inconclusive, but there is quite a bit of association. We don't know whether the diabetes is predisposing to vitamin D deficiency or vitamin D deficiency predisposes you to an increased risk of diabetes. But we have found that there is a higher frequency of vitamin D in patients with type 1 diabetes compared to healthy individuals. And prenatal vitamin D exposure of the fetus or women who may have avoided or not have access to vitamin D fortified food have been shown to possibly increase the risk of developing type 1 diabetes. Again, we don't have solid data about this, but further studies are ongoing. Now, what we do have very strong data about is vitamin D has a direct anti-inflammatory property in the lung, and it has been shown to reduce lots of morbidity and mortality associated with respiratory illness through its local action of reducing the inflammatory response that we see in ARDS and acute respiratory infections. So this obviously, like you can well imagine, because of COVID-19, there was a lot of renewed interest in vitamin D for COVID-19. So this was a large systematic review and meta-analysis of data from multiple trials looking at vitamin D supplementation and its role in acute respiratory infections. COVID-19 being on our minds for the last couple of years. So of this, about 46 randomized controlled trials were eligible in this meta-analysis, and they saw that a significantly lower proportion of participants in the vitamin D supplementation group had one or more uh, acute respiratory infections than in the placebo group, with an odds ratio which was 0.92, but there was a lot of heterogeneity between the studies. So the conclusion was that vitamin D supplementation appeared to be safe and does reduce the risk of acute respiratory infection despite lots of heterogeneity or differences between the trials. Protection was associated with administration of a daily dose of 400 to 1000 vitamin D for up to 12 months. Again, the caveat here was that the findings were as related to COVID-19 is not known and requires further investigation. So that's still ongoing. But a lot of people, a lot of centers did start that, although many guidelines did say that we don't have conclusive evidence regarding COVID, so one should not extrapolate from other acute respiratory infections. So this brings me to the end of my talk. The takeaway points that I hope to give to you today is that daily dose of vitamin D supplementation, either D2 or D3, may work well for most. There is a clear benefit for respiratory disease. We don't have a clear direct benefit for COVID, but it does apply for most respiratory diseases, and further studies are needed to explain the role in COVID. There is associations with diabetes type 1 and type 2, with sepsis, critical illness, but no definitive causation. Trial is underway, which should hopefully give us some answers in the next couple of years. So I would suggest check a level when giving supplementation periodically if the patient has a risk of hypercalcemia, especially in patients in whom you're giving a higher dose, and if you're giving weekly higher doses, please check a level periodically to make sure that you are not overshooting the target for vitamin D supplementation. And then remember to always give a maintenance dose once you've achieved that target. Generally, a range between 800 to 2000 is safe on a daily basis for healthy individuals to achieve a level of at least 30. And that's the takeaway that, for bone health, we have a clear go ahead. Keep your 25-hydroxyvitamin D level above 20. Above 30 is preferable. And then for most people, if you go for a goal of 30, you will also have some of the other added benefits for which causality is not definitive, but associations are definitely there. Thank you so much for this opportunity. This was my overview. I hope I've been able to go over that in detail with you. I'll take questions now. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a comprehensive presentation. Dr. Sara is with us for online. If you want to ask any question from her, you can ask.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm happy to take questions. Gigi, I can hear you.
In the presentation, Dr. Tahir Ghaffar told that low body weight is associated with osteoporosis. And the second thing is that hypothyroidism is least associated with osteoporosis. This is my first question, how you will explain this. My second question is that Pakistan being a tropical country, why vitamin D deficiency is so common in Pakistan? Why not in Europe and Canada?
Ji, assalamu alaikum. So I'll take the question, the tropical climate question that you've asked. You see, Pakistan is we have a lot of sunny days during the year. But as you know, most of our people dress up in a manner in which there is not a lot of sun exposure through the skin. Most of our people stay, covered up. So that is one. The other thing is people who have high pigmentation, high melanin content also have a lower vitamin D level. So those are the two reasons. The other question about low body weight predisposing to osteoporosis. So the more weight that there is put on the bones, so if you are underweight, there is less weight, less force on the bone. The bone, as you know, is a dynamic organ, right? So there is less dynamic changes. And that's why there is increased risk of osteoporosis in underweight people.
So why I should be slimmer to get osteoporosis?
So yes, there is a weight paradox here. We are not telling people not to be slimmer, but we are understanding that people who are of low body weight or who are of a petite frame have a higher risk. We are not encouraging people to gain weight just to avoid osteoporosis. I don't think that is the right approach for an endocrinologist, especially somebody who manages people with diabetes every day.
Okay, let's move on to our next talk. The topic of next talk is about why do bones break? Osteoporosis recent updates. And for this, I would like to invite Dr. Arshad Hussain. He is an esteemed physician and endocrinologist and Associate Dean Postgraduate Training at Northwest General Hospital and Research Center, Peshawar. Welcome, sir. And over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. I think we're short of time because we started very late. So I'll try my best to finish in time. So regarding osteoporosis, Tahir has already said a lot. I just want to give a little bit overview before we go into the treatment. That, so far, this is all American data, but I think just for reference, just to show you that more than 10 million Americans have osteoporosis. And there are an additional 43 million who have low bone mass. So these would be the one who may develop osteoporosis in the next few years' time. That's a huge number. And out of those, more than 2 million osteoporosis-related fractures occur each year in the United States, and 70% of them in women. That is also a huge number, So more than 20% of postmenopausal women have prevalent vertebral fracture. And I think, as Tahir has mentioned, mostly, these fractures, they remain unnoticed unless you start having disability or pain or, problems with it. And, apart from, as we know, that the hip fractures, carries very high mortality. But vertebral fractures not only carries high mortality, they carries high disability as well. And mostly, really, the mortality risk is from respiratory deaths. And I think this has been discussed in the previous presentation. Age is an independent risk factor for osteoporosis. So the older you get, the more the risk you have for osteoporosis. And they say that it is doubling every 5 to 10 years. So out of the data, when you look at it, that so nearly 1/4, like every 4th woman above 65 or older had osteoporosis. But once you bring the cutoff to 80, it goes to 1/3. So every 3rd woman actually has osteoporosis. And not only this, but a lot more people, they say about 50% postmenopausal women may have osteopenia as well. They are going to become osteoporotic. And it is a preventable and treatable disease, but only when you actually screen and you diagnose them in time. And lack of treatment is common. Even in America, they said fewer than 1 in 4 women aged 67 or older with osteoporosis-related fracture undergoes screening and maybe treatment for osteoporosis. So what to say about Pakistan? I think it's very patchy here as well. We don't know the numbers, but I think very few people might undergo to have the screening. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Tahir has already mentioned this, the WHO category criteria of classification of osteoporosis and osteopenia. However, this is not the only criteria. There is actually an additional criteria as well, which you can use in certain patients, like low trauma, spine or hip fractures, regardless of the BMD. If that is something, and you do apply the WHO criteria as well. Osteopenia or low bone mass, T-score between -1, -2.5 with a fragility fracture of proximal humerus, pelvis, or possibly distal forearm, or low bone mass or osteopenia and high FRAX scoring, which he mentioned, probability based on the country-specific thresholds. So other than that criteria, this can be applied both together or separate as well. And the FRAX scoring, which he has already mentioned, I think we are very lucky now we have Pakistan and Pakistani thresholds in it as well. You only have to go to tools and then select the table for Pakistan. Screening for postmenopausal osteoporosis, he has already mentioned, so I won't really spend much time on it, but both the ACE and US Preventive Task Force, they recommend that we should do the BMD testing for women aged 65 and older, as well as young postmenopausal women who are at increased risk of bone loss and fracture based on the fracture risk analysis. So normally, what's the presentation for osteoporosis? Usually, it may present only once a fracture happens, or it may be incidental finding that you come across, or if you're actively looking for osteoporosis, that's how you diagnose them. So fracture is the single most important manifestation of postmenopausal osteoporosis. And, it can be by just low energy injuries, such as a fall from a standing height. Vertebral fractures, however, occur during, routine daily activities. You may only notice it once it has happened, and then you started getting pain or disability from it, and that's how, you diagnose it. And as we know, hip fractures are the most serious consequence of osteoporosis. So women with hip fracture have an increased mortality of 12 to 20% during the subsequent 2 years. And not only that, but more than 50% hip fracture survivors are unable to return to the independent living as they were before, which is quite worrying. Other low trauma osteoporosis fractures of those of proximal humerus, pelvis, which you see in the elderly, they're very common as well. Before you go to the treatment, I know there's a very busy slide there, but it just really it gives you the different categories. Before you go to the treatment, I think you need to identify any coexisting medical condition which may exist, in addition to the osteoporosis. So an appropriate medical evaluation, may be needed in those cases. Like if you look on your left side, starting from your left, these are the endocrine disorder. And then there are nutritional, conditions like, celiac disease, malabsorption, which they have already alluded to. There are certain drugs, which are taken on regular basis, like chemotherapy, anti-epileptic medication, aromatase inhibitors, and so on. There's a long list of those as well. There are disorders of collagen metabolism, maybe people are born with those, like osteogenesis imperfecta, Marfan, etc. And there are certain other conditions which can, which may be, coexisting medical condition in addition to osteoporosis, and you may need to treat them as well. So because causes of secondary osteoporosis are common, so in apparently healthy postmenopausal women, so I think some laboratory testing, which Tahir has already shown these slides, they should be done like CBC and, the baseline panel. However, that's not all. Maybe in certain cases, when you find a secondary cause, it may be warranted, that you might need to do some further tests like, the PTH, TSH, and celiac screen, and, myeloma screens, and for hypercortisolism. There are so much, a huge list of those as well, but it all depends on what you have found. Coming back to a treatment, then, as we said, lifestyle modification is the one to start with. It improves musculoskeletal integrity and balance, and it preserves bone strength and preventive future fracture. As Dr. Sara Nadeem has mentioned already, that bone is a dynamic organ. I think if you put pressure on it, if you put some stress on it, it will respond to that as well. And apart from that, supplementation of vitamin D, like as already discussed, vitamin D3 at a dose of 1,000 to 2,000 units typically needed to maintain the optimal vitamin D levels. For age 50 or older, recommended calcium intake is 1,200 milligram a day. Lifelong participation in regular weight-bearing resistance exercise, balance improving exercise, and avoiding tobacco and excessive use of alcohol, and eliminating potential risk for falling. So the ACE guidelines strongly recommends pharmacologic therapy for the following patients: those who have osteopenia or low bone mass and a history of fragility fracture of the hip or spine, they should be put on pharmacotherapy. Those with a T-score of -2.5 or lower in the spine, femoral neck, total hip, as we already know, they need to be treated. But then those with a T-score between 1 and 2.5 who falls into osteopenia, but if the FRAX 10-year probability for major osteoporotic fracture is more than 20%, or the 10-year probability for hip fracture is more than 3% or above, then they should be treated as well. As we said, apart from the WHO criteria, the other criteria, this is applying the other criteria. So these are the high-risk patients. Now, what treatment modalities do we have available here? There are a lot of treatment modalities which are mentioned here. Some of them are not in use anymore, though they are available, like, daily bisphosphonates are not used anymore. A weekly bisphosphonate orally may still be used, but the compliance has been really a problem, and that is the problem with the treatment. Calcitonin, it has been used before, not used anymore. Used to use it intranasally, but I think it has more role in really pain control from the fracture. But in the past it has been used, but it's not that much in use now. Denosumab is available, and I think that is widely used as well. Estrogen, multiple regimes, depending on the cause, that has been used. Ibendronate are available weekly, monthly, and 3 monthly. Raloxifene, has been used as another hormone treatment, and the other one like Actonil or generic, other Zedronate, they've been used. And we'll be talking about the specific one, the one which is not mentioned here, which hasn't made up to the guidelines. I'll include that as well in the coming slides. And then we have abaloparatide, we have teriparatide, and we have zoledronic acid. So there are no head-to-head trials, comparing efficacy of approved drugs. However, there are 4 agents most commonly used, like alendronate, zedronate, zoledronic acid, and denosumab. There is a lot more evidence, and they have been used for the last many years in patients. And patients, who have lower or moderate fracture risk can be started on oral agents. So you can think about the oral agents if the risk is very low. Injectable agents such as teriparatide, abaloparatide, or denosumab, or zoledronic acid, they all can be considered as initial therapy for those who have a high risk fracture risk. So previously, we used to use the oral first, and then maybe if they are not working, we used to go to the injectable. However, the injectable can be used as a first-line drug, especially in the high-risk group. So for patient high risk of spine fracture, but not a risk of hip-or-vertebral fracture, then ibendronate or raloxifene, they can be used. Denosumab is also agent of choice in patients with renal insufficiency. So when denosumab came, because bisphosphonate cannot be used in people with the CKD. So then we had a trouble, but when the denosumab came in, there was a choice really, at least in the people who had renal insufficiency. This was a drug which still can be used in them. So denosumab, what is denosumab? It's a fully human monoclonal antibody. It inhibits the osteoclast formation and decreases bone resorption. However, it increases bone mineral density as well and reduces the risk of fracture. Now, if the creatinine clearance is more than 30, no dose adjustment. Even if it's less than 30, still there is no dose adjustment needed. However, we need to involve nephrology team in the ongoing care of the patient. And because this is unlikely to be removed by dialysis, so even if a patient is having 3 times a week dialysis, still can be used in patients with dialysis. And for osteoporosis, the dose is 60 milligram every 6 months subcutaneous. And there are other uses for this as well, other than osteoporosis, and it's also available in 120 milligram, especially, for hypercalcemia malignancy or bone metastasis or multiple myeloma. However, there are problems with denosumab. It is a fast-acting and very potent anti-resorptive agent. Its effects are rapidly reversible. The moment you stop it, the bone turnover rates increase to levels above the pretreatment baseline. So one should be aware of the post-denosumab rebound, and that need to be addressed in time. You may have heard sequential therapy in different treatments. Sequential therapy does exist in osteoporosis as well. So mostly it is, the way it is done is that you follow anabolic therapy with anti-resorptive agents. So treatment with anabolic agents like teriparatide or abaloparatide should always be followed by anti-resorptive treatment to prevent bone density decline, because you can use teriparatide for up to 24 months. So once you reach that stage, you cannot stop all the treatment. They may need to be switched to something else like anti-resorptive. So the bone density decline and loss of fracture effect. So the rationale for using an anti-resorptive agent after anabolic is based on both the limited period that anabolic is used for. Now, what about combination therapy? Can we use combination therapy in this? This is not like vitamin D and other ones, but this is just the two specific drugs for osteoporosis. So combination therapy for osteoporosis are being evaluated. There are not yet that many studies to show us the evidence. But like bisphosphonate and PTH and LAC combination suggest that they do not provide, they have been used, and experimentally, but, they did not provide substantial clinical benefit compared with the monotherapy. And the most promising combination which came out of these studies is teriparatide and denosumab. The data study showed that bone mineral density at the spine and hip increased significantly more in postmenopausal women on this combination compared to either drug alone. Now, combination therapy, what does ACE recommend? ACE does not recommend any does not recommend any combination therapy, because they say the cost is too high and there is a potential for increasing, side effects. However, there is not, there is still a window for, certain patients. In certain situations, when the patient needs a stronger agent because the fracture risk is especially high, or there is a demonstrated suboptimal effect from raloxifene or any hormone therapy, a high bone resorption markers or progression of BMD. So any of these, yet the patient has specific non-bone reasons to continue with these agents, then another anti-resorptive agents or anabolic therapy could be added onto the therapy. So if you have any of these problems that despite being under treatment, you're having BMD loss, or your bone resorption markers are quite high, then maybe you can go to combination therapy. This is a very busy slide from ACE, but they actually made it very specific and very easy. If you look on your left side, they made it just basically in bigger two main categories. One, no prior fragility fracture, and then you go on down the algorithm. These are available. I've just shared the link there as well, if you want to see. And on the right side are the one who had either fragility fracture or the very high risk of fractures. Then you go on to this arm of the treatment. So as Tahir has already mentioned, there are certain guidelines, from different societies when you should have a follow-up DEXA scan, mostly say after 2 years. However, that's not an absolute figure, because, you may not wait for 2 years to come to know that the therapy you have given isn't working and the patient may have had more fractures. There may be some other ways to see whether your therapy you're giving is working or not. There are bone markers, which are only specific group patients before and 3 and 6 months after treatment, you check them. There's a fasting NTX, which is urinary N-terlipeptide or serum carboxyterminal, we call it CTX. A reduction of 50 to 30% in NTX or CTX shows compliance and treatment efficacy. However, if you're not getting any reduction like this, then you may need to think about changing the treatment. But these markers are only useful when patient is on anti-resorptive treatment and not on teriparatide or romosozumab, which I'll be talking about in a minute. Now, if there is a decline in BMD of more than 5%, I think you should switch from oral to IE bisphosphonate, denosumab, teriparatide, or abaloparatide, or the MOMABs, So any of those, so that is also, from the guidance. So fractures while you take bisphosphonate is also an issue, that while you're taking bisphosphonate, you're still getting fractures. So in that case, you should switch anabolic agent like teriparatide or abaloparatide or the MOMABs or denosumabs. unique management challenge comes from CKD because CKD is associated with renal osteodystrophy and maybe osteitis fibrosa cystica, which is secondary hyperparathyroidism or mixed osteodystrophy. Diagnosis of osteoporosis should only be made after you exclude renal osteodystrophy. So the romosozumab or MOMABs, in other words, like adalimumabs, although they used to be known as MOMABs, just to make it easy. It is an anabolic agent. It's another anabolic agent, at least now we've got, and it got its license in 2019. And the possible, indication are the one with multiple fragility fractures, those at high risk of fracture or intolerant to other therapies, or those who fail other osteoporosis therapy. It is monoclonal anti-sclerostin antibody, it is, if you know the basic, osteoporosis, the pathophysiology, sclerostin, all these things are mentioned. So it's one of the therapy which works really at the sclerostin level. So it is anti-sclerostin antibody, and sclerostin is produced by osteocyte and inhibits bone formation. Treatment is usually 210 milligrams monthly by subcutaneous injection for 12 months only. So only 12 injections so far, can be given. However, there's a problem with it. If anybody who has really risk of myocardial infarction or stroke, that can be increased as well. So anyone who had really stroke or MI in the last 1 year time, may not be given this drug. Abaloparatide is a parathyroid hormone analog. It is also used as initial treatment like teriparatide in high fracture risk, including those with a T-score of less than -3 or T-score of -2.5 with a fragility fracture. I think one need to assess serum calcium level before we started, to rule out any hypercalcemic disorder, because you cannot give this drug if somebody has hypercalcemia already. Vitamin D deficiency need to be corrected. In animal model, when it was given to the rats, some of them did develop osteosarcoma. So there is a caution with it. However, they say because the rats were very small, and they were given the current dose of 80 microgram a day, so it was quite a huge dose. So it may be dose-dependent risk, but however, it still need to be really highlighted. Duration of therapy is usually, again, 2 years, so you may not need to, go beyond that. So I'm coming towards the finishing the presentation, but I thought I would not go home without, showing this.
We are running short of time.
Yes, there's only
Just-
2 slides and not that many. But this is for Osama. I don't know whether he's in the audience or not, but osteoporosis in men, it's not good to have osteoporosis being a man because, the risk and mortality is quite high, and treatment options are accordingly either eugonadal, hypogonadal, or hypogonadal with high risk fractures. And these are some of the causes which he has already mentioned, but I thought I'll show you this slide as well if he had time. But I think we're very short of time, so I'll go, but I'll show you this, the effect of testosterone or placebo treatment for 12 months on volumetric bone density, and the slide speaks for itself if you look at it. However, not all news are bad. This is the good news. And if you look at the 24-year-old man versus 40-year-old man versus 73-year-old man, and you look at these TBN, the trabecular number, the trabecular number remains the same in men. It is the trabecular thickness which is, coming down, and the trabecular space is increasing. The number remains the same, and that is one of the protective factor for them. And I'll just end up my presentation here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Arshad, for such a comprehensive talk. We have few minutes for question answers. If you have any question from Dr. Tahir or Dr. Arshad, please raise your hand.
Actually, she was Dr. Sara was online, and that's why I wanted her to reply to the question on vitamin D. And you asked about osteoporosis as well regarding the series. We said that a low bone mass, low BMI related to the osteoporosis. This is something which is true because they don't develop usually the adequate bone mass. This is related. But on the other side, obesity is also the one which is not correlated with any good bone health. So it's the normal weight that is associated. So I didn't say about hypothyroidism. I asked about untreated hyperthyroidism to be associated with osteoporosis. Probably I don't know that hypothyroidism is the one which is associated with the normal BMD. Probably a normal thing will be related with something of the normal. I don't know. that if hypothyroidism is really associated with a good BMD or decreased risk of osteoporosis. I think every disease is related with that. So a normal BMD or normal BMI should be related, or a normal thyroid function, not a hypothyroidism.
मेरा क्वेश्चन है डॉक्टर अर्शद से कि अगर पेशेंट को अक्यूट फ्रैक्चर हुआ है सेकेंडरी टू ऑस्टियोपोरोसिस, तो हम बिसफॉस्फोनेट्स यूज कर सकते हैं कि नहीं कर सकते?
No, they are not indicated, if they have acute fracture, because I think it has been the practice, in the past that people were coming with a head fracture, had DHS, and they had IV bisphosphonate before they left. So that adversely affect the healing of the fracture. So you have to wait for the bone to heal before you give bisphosphonates.
Okay, thank you so much. And it was an excellent presentation by all three speakers on such a important topic, yet underrated. My question is from Dr. Arshad. Can you just explain the reason behind this? Whenever we use denosumab, we have to follow that by bisphosphonate. I mean, even 6 months we spam nahi de sakte. What is the reason behind that? Any pathophysiology or any other thing? Because that is in the guidelines that denosumab is always followed by bisphosphonate. The second question will be that maybe for the audience, which I know the answer, just for the sake of interest. Parathyroid has always been considered a destructive hormone. Parathyroidism, hyperparathyroidism leads to osteoporosis. And we see a lot of osteoporosis patient having hyperparathyroidism. How can teriparatide, which is a parathyroid analog, be used in the treatment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mati. So just to answer your second question first, teriparatide is an analog. It is an anabolic agent, and for many years, it was the only anabolic agent which was available. It is used in severe osteoporosis. You're right, if you have your endogenous hyperparathyroidism, so there is a shift of calcium outside from the bones. So from the bones it's taken outside, and the bones really become fragile. Once the parathyroid is removed, when you have parathyroid adenoma, then your osteoporosis should get better. However, especially I think in the initial thing for teriparatide came in when the vertebral fractures were happening and there was no anabolic agent, because in the fractures there is no anti-resorptive which was working, and it may not be working because you need to build up on the bones. So this was used mainly, and I think it's still the indication was glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis was the main indication for teriparatide. However, still, if you have vertebral fractures, it still remains because this is the anabolic. So by the anabolic effects, it builds the bone rather than anti-resorptive, and that is the whole mechanism for it.
I respectfully disagree. I would respectfully disagree because parathyroid hormone, when it is produced by adenoma, that is constant. Whenever it is constantly produced, it results in resorption. But when we give in a dose that is monthly dose or 6 monthly dose, then it becomes something which becomes anabolic. And what about the second question?
First question. What was the first question? Oh yeah, denosumab followed. Yes, as I have shown you in the slides, they said the denosumab effect lasts for very short time. The moment you stopped it, even after 2 years or 3 years, it has to be followed by anti-resorptive treatment, because the moment you stopped it, they go back to the pre-treatment level very quickly. So that is the reason that it has to be followed by anti-resorptive treatment.
The last question.
My question is from Dr. Arshad. For how long we should give these abandonate these drugs in postmenopausal women when we don't have facilities for much investigations in peripheral areas?
Mike.
I think bisphosphonates can be given for a much longer period. There are some guidelines which suggest that, you should have a drug holiday after 5 years if they have achieved the BMD which you want them to have. However, there is always a catch in these things. The fine details are, that if you're giving bisphosphonates and you're doing serial, DEXA scans, you're looking at the BMD. If the BMD is not improving, if you're not getting your results, I think you may need to switch to a different agent, which could be IV from oral, or it could be the other drugs which I have shown you. So you may not need to wait for 2 years to have a DEXA scan to tell you that your bone mass has not improved. So you may look at that much earlier as well. So in your case, you can give bisphosphonate for 5 to 10 years, only if you are getting any response. If you're not getting any response, then you may not need to give it really for longer, and you may need to switch to some other drug.
Thank you.
Excuse
Now-
me, is there any clinical marker in which we can judge that the patient is getting response or not?
The urinary NTX and the CTX I've shown you that you can check them, once you start the therapy, before 3 months and 6 months after, then you check it and see if there is a reduction in the bone resorption marker up to 50% for the NTX and up to 30% for CTX. Then you can say, yes, the therapy is working. But if you're not getting those results, then you can switch the therapy to any other.
Thank you. Now I would request our worthy panelists for their valuable comments regarding today's session. Dr. Abbas Raza, sir.
I think it was a wonderful session, taking into account whatever was discussed, and I'm very happy to hear the questions that are actually addressed by Mati, like always, and other audience were not related to vitamin D, and I was so happy not to be asked about the question regarding vitamin D, and actually they were related to the osteoporosis and the mechanism of action of PTH. I think that the treatment of osteoporosis needs to be taken care by endocrinologist. And I was just sharing my experience with my co-chair that when I moved up, the place I was trained at was the major site for osteoporosis and osteoporosis care. So I felt very comfortable treating osteoporosis. And again, when I came back, I was invited for a talk, and it was an osteoporosis orthopedic conference where an endocrinologist was giving a talk, and I was not well received actually. And one of the speakers said the time has come and an endocrinologist is going to teach us how to treat osteoporosis, and I was ashamed of the fact that the realization of osteoporosis, because usually orthopedic don't treat osteoporosis, and we don't, as endocrinologists and general physicians, don't take the ownership of treating osteoporosis, so it becomes the most neglected diseases in our population. So I think the meetings like this brings up a very important point that osteoporosis is out there. We need to be vigilant about it, and we need to treat it as well. And again, all of us have to contribute in making sure that we, number one, diagnose, number two, treat osteoporosis.
Thank you. Dr. Khalid Usman, sir.
I appreciate, and it was a wonderful session by all the three speakers. So just a simple thing, I was talking to Abbas, that more questions will be about vitamin D from the GPs, and none of you ask any question. So can I ask from the audience, if you are asymptomatic, should we take vitamin D? Raise your hand. So that means that not everyone should take vitamin D, because it's such a contending issue and such a burning issue that we give vitamin D left, right, Z to everyone. And the plea of the GP or anyone is that because the test cost about 3,000, if I give it, it won't make any difference. So
I think we should ask, how many of this audience is actually taken vitamin D
themselves?
So I am assuming all of you are symptomatic. Because you wouldn't treat your patient if they're asymptomatic. And again, I want to see everyone limp or have a bone pain before they leave the room.
Yes.
some symptoms जो उसको bother करते हैं, and they are there. A lot of times a lot of our my colleagues or friends वो उसको बस कहे कि आपको anxiety है, आपको depression है, and we dismiss her. But I just want to know that in your experience, because we don't have the facility to test them all, what will be those alarming features where कि अगर उसने ये 3 चीजें बोल दी, तो because she has 5 kids also, and of course she's from a poor setup, what will be those 3 or 4 alarming features in your experience you would take the chance of treating her with the loading dose of and the continuation for 6 to 8 weeks and hope to see the results? Test nahi hai.
It's very, very difficult to say, you know, because majority of those patients, they comes, major complaint is aches and pains. By the time they comes to us, you know, somebody would have given vitamin D. So you can't predict, you know, they come with a very vague symptoms. So you will find their vitamin D level, you know, like if I would be very careful, if you find somebody less than 10, you must treat it. But we see sometimes patient come with vitamin D level of 10 and they are walking around and they have no symptoms. So my suggestion was that should we treat those patients as well? And if we don't treat, so what?
I
So,
agree,
so
sir.
to
Wo to
answer
I
this,
agree.
I think Sarah has given a point. There is no point in discussing that the white bone health is dependent on vitamin D levels, which is above 30. Anyone below 30 who's not taking optimal dose of vitamin D should be replaced for the reason. My argument, and again, to comment on your thing is, we need to look at the information what we have. So the truth of vitamin D deficiency lies between that vitamin D is a hoax. No one should be taking vitamin D, and vitamin D is just a pharmaceutical proven deficiency which no one should be replaced. Just like people who say the vaccines are hoax and no one should take vaccine. To an extent, the other extreme of it is that people say that dinosaurs died because they had vitamin D deficiency. So the truth of vitamin D and its reality lies somewhere in between, that you need to replace it. And we as scientists, and I think we are all with medicine, we all practice science. We don't practice out of ourselves. So I do not want to tell you that I replace everyone with vitamin D because I just think it is better. So the information that I have as an endocrinologist is that all the studies which have been done shows a low vitamin D in my population. All the studies that I know of, vitamin D is made, and again, please raise hand if any one of you following. Vitamin D is made optimally, is made from May to end of July to mid-August, from 2 p.m., I think 12:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. in the afternoon while you're in your swimming costume. How many of us are in summers? Believe me, in Lahore, if you're in your swimming costume at 2 p.m. in Lahore, you probably, maybe he is, then you probably either have a skin cancer or, so again, we don't get exposure. So again, we need to find a way and I honestly don't buy the idea when people say if it's 90% prevalent or 60% prevalent, it's not actually a disease. So what you are actually telling me is that in Pima Indians, if 60% of Pima Indians have diabetes, we shouldn't even treat diabetes in Pima Indians. It doesn't make sense to me. It's a known fact. We treat it. We shouldn't over treat it. And Sarah very nicely pointed out, I don't like to give 600,000 international units of vitamin D on a weekly basis, which I see on prescriptions to my patient, which I don't. Need a maintenance dose, and again, checking vitamin D on a regular basis is a whole new argument which I don't want to get into. I don't think we should check vitamin D because it's an expensive test. If you start someone on maintenance dose, just start them and just leave them and they do it.
So I completely agree, sir. But thoda sa wo ho gaya. My point was this: I completely agree. If the patient has no symptoms, then I suppose it's an expensive test. फिर तो I'm not even advising him to get it tested. So I'm not treating it, end of woe, because he has no symptoms. So in my experience, like I feel majority of the ladies, I'm talking about the tertiary class, they come
we are
with
running
depression
short of time.
and fatigue. And I'm not gonna lie, I have taken a chance, taking into account her, number of kids she has, her dietary intake, exposure to sun, being covered all the time, all those things. And then depression did go away with those 4 weeks or 8 weeks.
So in the interest of the time, I would second you on
Thank
that.
you.
And again,
Sorry.
I would second you on that and say vitamin D replacement does work in a lot of people. And again, we need to look deep into it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. At the end, I would request Dr. Abrar to come on stage to distribute sheet among the speakers and the panelists. First of all, I would request Dr. Tahir to come on stage to receive his shield of appreciation. Next, I would request Dr. Arshad Hussain to please come on stage. Next, Dr. Abbas Raza, sir, please come forward. Dr. Khalid Usman, sir, please come forward. With this, I would like to conclude this session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.